A warning before I start this video. The story I'm reviewing today has sexual content and sexualized violence, some of which will be triggering for some people. Oh, and I don't mean in that internet meme way that is commonly used, but that it could be a trauma trigger. So yeah, viewer discretion is advised. Also, there's one thing I'll say in this review that is a flat out lie to avoid spoiling the twist in part 6 of the story. So please don't give me a hard time over that, and no spoilers in the comments. All that being said, I'll be reviewing yet another isekai. Except, this time the protagonist isn't a geek. She was one of the popular kids, and instead of the new world being heaven, it's god-awful for her. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present JK Haru is a sex worker in another world. So, an otaku, Chiba, tries to save a girl in his class, Haru, from getting run over by a truck, and instead gets them both killed. They are reincarnated in a fantasy world, God gives Chiba a bunch of cheat abilities, and Haru gets squat. Now, in a normal isekai, Chiba would be our protagonist, and Haru his first love interest. But not here. We follow Haru, who gets given an unenviable choice. Women's rights isn't exactly a big thing in this world, so she can either become a slave or a prostitute. As you can tell from the title, she chooses the latter option. What follows is then an unvarnished look at sex work and a commentary on the isekai genre. There are descriptions of the sex Haru has, but they're short and tend to be unflattering. They're not there for fat material, but to detail what she has to go through. The story is kind of a slice of life, just for someone who's in a shit situation trying to make the best of it, instead of some cute girls doing cute things. Haru is supremely unrelatable to me. She was popular back in Japan, she looked down on nerds with scorn, and wasn't that big into school. Kinda my polar opposite. That being said, I still really like her as a character. She's funny and snarky, she's continually upbeat and optimistic, and to be quite frank, absolutely incredibly brave. Her character is really what drives the story forward, because you very quickly come to empathize for Haru and just want everything to work out for her. Chiba, the nerd on the other hand, is a complete dirtbag. Given that he knows all these isekai tropes, he has some, interesting expectations coming to this world. He figures that he'll just have a harem poof up for him with no effort, and that he'll be able to surpass all the warriors that have come before him with no effort. And, of course, he'll be the chosen one to save the world. Oh yeah, he also pays to have sex with Haru, and offers to take her on as his own personal slave. So yeah, he kind of represents the worst nerd culture has on offer, and unfortunately is probably more realistic than the average isekai protagonist. Other than that, we have Sumo, an obese chef who is a complete sweetheart, and a prime example of why nice guys finish last, Kyori, a pure priestess who acts as something of a foil for Haru, and Mr. Rain, not his actual name, a dark and mysterious older gentleman who Haru's infatuated with. Despite only being one volume long, all these characters, excluding Mr. Rainman, grow quite a bit through the course of the story, and end up pretty well developed, especially Haru. She's matured so much by the end, it kind of feels like a coming of age story for her in an odd way. Sex is a hard thing to discuss. Sexual violence is harder to discuss, and discussing sex work is generally taboo. But JK Haru addresses these topics admirably. His discussion is mature, not making light of difficult topics while still remaining accessible. It manages to tread a very fine line between being too disturbing and glossing things over. Some scenes will still make you feel like you've been punched in the gut, but they were never done casually, they had a purpose. I also really appreciated the frank descriptions of sex from the female perspective. They were eye-opening to say the least. Haru's inner monologues were biting and often hilarious. There's definitely a bit of bruising of the male ego here, but it's absolutely warranted. The other thing I would praise this series for is how it dealt with power dynamics. In many isekais, the protagonist is so overpowered, the readers never really worry for their safety. Haru, though, is in a very vulnerable position. She doesn't have Chiba's cheat abilities, and her status is the very lowest of the low in society. She doesn't have anyone to come and save her, so she has nothing to rely on but her own wits. This can make the story incredibly tense at some points. Despite combat not being a focus of this series, I found myself far more worried for the safety of Haru and her co-workers than I ever have been for characters of more traditional action-oriented isekai. I stayed up late every Sunday when J Novel Club released a new chapter of the series just to see if everyone was alright. JK Haru is too short. As I already mentioned, it just has one volume. Well, technically there is a sequel, but it was self-published by the author and doesn't look like it's getting an English translation. Short stories are fine if the story is nicely wrapped up at the end, with a bow on top. JK Haru doesn't do that. It has an ending, of sorts, however, the number of plot threads left to be tied up leave the reader wanting to know what happens next. Also, right before the end, the author does a bit of world building, going through the world's creation myth, which was really interesting. It seems like the author was saying, "Oh, look, I have all this new material to share, but the story's done now. Bye!" Can you tell I'm a little frustrated? The other complaint I would lodge is that sometimes I got real emotional whiplash from the story, where at one moment it would be super serious, dealing with sexual assault, and the next moment it's all jokes and a game of kick the can. Both scenes were great individually, but having one follow so closely after the other lessened the impact of both. Spacing things out a bit better, and taking more time with each individual event would have helped hugely. To be very clear, this story is not for everyone. If hearing about sexual assault is triggering for you, don't read this. That being said, I think this story is the most original isekai I've read, and it does a great job humanizing people in what is a very stigmatized profession. I would recommend it with the caveat that you are A, over the age of 18, and B, think you can deal with hearing about, the subject matter presented. If you want to read JK Haru as a sex worker in another world, you can pick it up from J Novel Club, which did a great job with the translation and deserves huge thanks for taking the risk to license this. I've put a link to their site in the description below. Anyways, thank you for listening to this review. I hope you enjoyed it. Cheers!